Little puppy runs to officer crying. He turns pale when he sees the puppy's collar. Officer James Carter had seen a lot in his 10 years on the force, but nothing quite like this. It was a quiet evening, and he was finishing his patrol shift when he heard faint whimpers coming from a nearby alley. Curious, he turned his flashlight toward the sound. Out of the darkness, a tiny golden retriever puppy came stumbling toward him. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its eyes were filled with fear and desperation. It let out a soft whimper before collapsing at his feet, exhausted. James knelt down, gently picking up the trembling pup. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured, trying to calm the shivering animal. He instinctively checked the puppy's collar, hoping to find an ID tag so he could return it to its owner. But the moment his eyes landed on the engraved name, all the color drained from his face. The tag read, "Buddy, if found, call Officer James Carter." His heart pounded in his chest. He had given this collar to his fiancée, Emily, a year ago when they adopted Buddy together. But Emily had gone missing 6 months ago without a trace. The case had gone cold, and James had been drowning in guilt ever since. How had Buddy ended up here? And more importantly, where was Emily? James scooped up the puppy, his mind racing. If Buddy was here, it meant Emily might still be out there, somewhere. The little dog had found its way back to him for a reason, and James was going to follow that reason wherever it led. James clutched Buddy close to his chest, his pulse hammering in his ears. The puppy whimpered, nudging its tiny nose against his uniform as if urging him to move. He wasted no time. He carried Buddy to his patrol car, gently placing him on the passenger seat before speeding toward the station. As soon as he arrived, he rushed inside, barely acknowledging his fellow officers as he strode straight to his desk. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and dialed Emily's number, just in case. Straight to voicemail. Just like always. James ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. If Buddy was here, someone had to have brought him. Someone who knew where Emily was. He reached for the collar again, turning it over in his hands. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, fresh scratch on the metal tag. His breath caught. It wasn't just a scratch. It was a message. 3 numbers, etched in uneven lines. 142. A location? A code? James didn't know, but he wasn't going to sit around and wonder. He pulled up the city map on his computer and started searching. 142, he muttered, scrolling through possibilities. Then it hit him. 142, Millstone Avenue. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. James stood abruptly, grabbing his keys. "I need backup at 142 Millstone," he barked into his radio. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't wait. Buddy had found him for a reason, and James wasn't about to let that reason slip away. He glanced at the puppy, who stared back at him with knowing eyes. "Let's go find Emily." The gunshot rang out, loud and sharp, echoing off the metal walls. James dropped to a knee, his gun aimed in the direction of the shot, heart hammering. Emily gasped, her body tensing, but she was unharmed. The bullet had missed. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, masked, holding a pistol. His stance was shaky, like he hadn't expected James to show up so soon. "Drop the gun," James barked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. The masked man hesitated. Buddy, still at the warehouse entrance, let out a low growl. Then, without warning, the puppy bolted forward, his tiny legs carrying him straight toward Emily. The distraction was just enough. James took his shot. Bang! The masked man screamed, dropping his gun as he clutched his shoulder. James was on him in seconds, kicking the weapon away and pinning him to the ground. "Who sent you?" James growled, yanking the mask off. His breath caught. It was Mark Holloway, Emily's ex-boyfriend. James' grip tightened. "Where have you been keeping her? Who else is involved?" Mark sneered despite the pain. "You'll never stop them. You think I was working alone?" He chuckled darkly. "This is bigger than you, Carter." James didn't have time for riddles. He grabbed his radio. "Suspect in custody. I need an ambulance at 142 Millstone now." Then, he rushed to Emily, cutting the ropes binding her wrists. The moment she was free, She collapsed into his arms. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. James held her tight, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "I'll always find you," Buddy yipped excitedly, wagging his tail as he jumped up at Emily's lap. She laughed weakly, stroking his fur. But James couldn't shake Mark's words. "You think I was working alone?" This wasn't over. And James knew whoever else was behind this was still out there, watching, waiting. James tightened his arms around Emily, feeling her trembling against him. He could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching, but his mind was still stuck on Mark's chilling words. "You think I was working alone?" Emily lifted her head slightly, her face pale but determined. "James, there's more," she whispered. James pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "Tell me everything." She swallowed hard. "Mark wasn't the one who took me. He's just a pawn. There's someone else, someone bigger." James' jaw clenched. "Who?" Emily hesitated, her eyes darting toward Mark, who was groaning on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Then, in a barely audible voice, she said a name that sent ice through James' veins. "Chief Reynolds." James stiffened. "Chief Reynolds? His own boss?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "That's not possible." But deep down, something inside him twisted. Over the past few months, Reynolds had shut down any new leads in Emily's case. He had dismissed James' concerns, telling him to let it go. And now Mark, Emily's ex, a man with no known connections, was here, involved in her kidnapping. James' gut churned. Had Reynolds been covering up the truth all along? The sirens grew louder. Any second now, officers would storm in, including those James once trusted. He didn't know who was on his side anymore. He glanced down at Emily, at Buddy, who sat protectively by her side. They needed to get out of here.
Now.
James stood, gripping his gun. He turned to Emily. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though weakly. He helped her to her feet, wrapping an arm around her waist. Mark let out a low chuckle from the ground. "You won't get far, Carter," he spat. "They're already watching." James ignored him. He had no time for threats. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered, getting Emily to safety. Because if Chief Reynolds was truly behind this, then no one could be trusted. James' mind raced as he led Emily toward the warehouse exit, his grip firm around her waist. Buddy trotted beside them, his little tail wagging nervously. The sirens were too close now. If Chief Reynolds really was behind this, James knew he couldn't trust the incoming officers. Emily tugged at his arm. "James, we can't just run. They'll hunt us down." James exhaled sharply. She was right. Running would make them look guilty. But staying meant walking straight into a trap. His eyes darted to the shadows outside. There had to be another way out. Then he spotted it, a rusted metal door at the far end of the warehouse. An emergency exit. James turned to Emily. "Follow me." They hurried toward the door, careful to stay quiet. But just as James reached for the handle,
Bang!
The main entrance burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness. "James Carter, put your weapon down." A dozen officers flooded in, their guns trained on him. At the front of the pack stood Chief Reynolds. His sharp eyes locked onto James, a slow smirk creeping across his face. Well, Reynolds said, stepping forward. "Caught red-handed, Officer Carter. Rescuing a missing person without calling it in? That's suspicious." James' fingers tightened around his gun. "Cut the act, Reynolds. I know you're involved." Reynolds let out a low chuckle. "That's a dangerous accusation, son." He motioned to his officers. "Take his weapon. And secure the girl." James stepped in front of Emily.
No.
He wouldn't let them take her. But before he could react, Buddy suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously. The tiny pup wasn't big enough to do damage, but his sudden movement startled the officers. That was the moment James needed. In one swift motion, he grabbed Emily's hand and shoved open the emergency exit. They ran, bullets cracked the air behind them, but James didn't stop. He yanked Emily through the alley, Buddy scrambling to keep up. The night swallowed them whole as they disappeared into the darkness. They were fugitives now. and the only way to survive was to expose the truth. James didn't stop running until they were deep into the city, weaving through alleys and side streets. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to stay calm. Emily clung to his hand, her breathing ragged, while Buddy padded beside them, determined to keep up. Finally, they reached an old abandoned motel on the outskirts of town. James pushed open the door to one of the empty rooms and ushered Emily inside, locking it behind them. Emily collapsed onto the bed, her face pale. "James, what do we do now?" James paced the room, trying to think. They had no backup, no safe place to go, and now they were the ones being hunted. "We expose Reynolds," James said finally. "We find proof. Something undeniable." Emily nodded, though fear lingered in her eyes. "He won't let us get that far." James knew she was right. Reynolds had already covered up her disappearance for months. He wouldn't hesitate to silence them now. Just then, Buddy let out a small bark. He was nosing at something, Emily's torn sleeve. James' eyes narrowed. "Emily, did they ever let you out of the warehouse?" She hesitated.
Once.
"Mark took me somewhere, a house. I was blindfolded, but I remember the smell of coffee. And there was a clock, an old one that chimed every half hour." James' mind clicked. A cafe. A small one. There weren't many in town that matched that description. He pulled out his phone and searched. After a moment, he found it. Harper's Cafe. A quiet little place on the west side of town. "That's it," Emily whispered, looking at the screen. "That's where they took me." James grabbed his keys. "Then that's where we start." As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A message. "Unknown number. Turn back now, Carter. Or you won't live to regret it." James' blood ran cold. They were already being watched. James stared at the message on his phone, the weight of the threat settling over him like a cold shadow. He turned to Emily, who was still sitting on the bed, her eyes wide with fear. "They're closing in," James muttered, slipping the phone into his pocket. "We have to move now." He didn't wait for a response. They didn't have the luxury of hesitation anymore. They were running out of time, and every second they wasted put them one step closer to being caught. The three of them, James, Emily, and Buddy, slipped into the night again. But this time, it wasn't just about running. They were going to end it. They drove to Harper's Cafe, the small, inconspicuous place nestled on a quiet street corner. The cafe's lights were dim, the windows fogged over with condensation from the chilly night air. James pulled up around the back, parking in a shadowed corner. He motioned for Emily to stay close, and with Buddy in tow, they moved toward the side door. They stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing softly as they entered. The cafe was empty except for a man sitting at a corner table. James' heart skipped a beat as he recognized the man, Chief Reynolds. Reynolds looked up, his face twisting into a smile that sent a shiver down James' spine. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Carter," he said, standing slowly. James drew his gun, his eyes never leaving Reynolds. "It's over, Reynolds. This ends tonight." Emily stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "You took me. You had me locked up. You used Mark to keep me quiet. What's your endgame?" Reynolds chuckled darkly. "You think this is about you, Emily? You were just the bait. The real game is much bigger than your little kidnapping." The night air was crisp as James and Emily sat on the hood of the car, watching the distant lights of the police scene fade behind them. It felt surreal, the weight of everything they had endured now slowly lifting from their shoulders. Buddy, his fur still matted from the days of fear, now sat contentedly between them, wagging his tail in peaceful oblivion. The chaos was over. Reynolds was behind bars, Mark was locked up, and the web of deceit had been unraveled. James turned to Emily, his eyes softening. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." Emily looked at him, a mixture of relief and exhaustion in her eyes. She rested her head against his shoulder. "It is," she said, her voice trembling. "And we can move forward now. Together." James took her hand, squeezing it gently. They both knew there was a long road ahead, healing from the pain, rebuilding trust, and reclaiming the life they once had. But for the first time in months, it felt like they had a chance to do all of that. The sound of a distant siren wailing off in the distance didn't seem as ominous as it had before. This time, it was just a reminder that the nightmare was behind them. Buddy looked up at them, his eyes full of warmth and affection, the silent hero of their story. As the stars began to emerge in the sky, James smiled softly, knowing that no matter what came next, they had each other. And that, finally, was enough.
The end.